Richmond was under siege. Ulysses S. Grant's armies closed in, surrounding the Confederate capital with a relentless grip. Robert E. Lee, weary and outnumbered, sent word to Jefferson Davis, "Evacuate immediately." He could hold off Grant's army for only one more day. In the chaos, Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge, who had begged Davis to surrender, saw the truth. The war was lost. Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederacy's brilliant but exhausted statesman, saw it too. But Davis remained defiant, clinging to a desperate dream of victory. But Breckinridge, Benjamin, and Postmaster General John Henniger Reagan knew the truth, and they enacted a plan they had long kept hidden. Breckinridge secured what remained of the Confederate treasury, gold, silver, and bonds, while Benjamin sent a final flurry of coded letters to trusted leaders, urging them to flee to the Yucatan settlement. If the Confederacy was dying, its fire would not be extinguished. They boarded a train bound for North Carolina, slipping away as the capital collapsed behind them. Ulysses S. Grant was no tactical genius like Sheridan or Sherman, but he didn't need to be. What he possessed was far more dangerous: an iron will. Unlike Lee, shackled to a chaotic government that denied him reinforcements, rejected his pleas to arm slaves, and fractured under the weight of its own governors, Grant served a single, powerful leader who supplied him with everything he needed: men, money, and endless industrial might. Grant's philosophy of war was ruthless. He crushed cities, burned crops, starved civilians, and tore through the South with a strategy some called barbaric. And he was winning. With Richmond in flames and Lee's army on the brink of annihilation, Breckinridge and Benjamin made their choice. The future of the South would not be decided on these battlefields. It would be carried to new shores. Along the way, news reached them. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The South's great army was gone. Then came an even darker shock. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. To Breckinridge, this was a sign of coming chaos. The fragile Union would demand vengeance. There would be no negotiation, no safe haven for Confederate leaders on American soil. The escape was no longer a desperate gamble. It was a necessity.
Under cover of darkness, the small party slipped out of North Carolina, bound for the Gulf Coast. The rail lines were shattered, bridges burned, and every road was thick with danger. Union patrols scoured the countryside, and lawlessness reigned where armies had marched. Escorted by a hand-picked detachment of hardened Kentucky soldiers, Breckinridge, Benjamin, and Reagan moved cautiously, slipping through the cracks of a collapsing Confederacy. By the time they reached Tampa, they were ghosts, carrying the last vestiges of a dead nation and the hope of a new one.
In Tampa, the fugitives found Stephen Mallory, the Confederacy's embattled Secretary of the Navy. Mallory had been part of the plan from the very beginning, working with Benjamin and Breckinridge to prepare their flight across the Gulf before Richmond had even fallen. Alongside him waited the daring naval officer John Taylor Wood, who had eluded capture with the same audacity that had defined his service at sea. Together, they prepared for the most dangerous leg of their journey. The Gulf was unforgiving. Storms swept in without warning, turning the sea into a churning maze of black waves and lightning. More than once, their ship narrowly avoided discovery. Every man aboard knew the Confederacy was finished. All they carried was a battered treasury, a handful of documents, and a fragile hope that Ellis's whispered dream of a Yucatan refuge was real.
The port of Cecil, a modest stretch of docks and warehouses clinging to the Yucatan coast. It was no city of refuge, no grand bastion of southern power, just a lonely outpost battered by wind and salt. As they stepped ashore, Breckinridge, Benjamin, and Reagan wondered if this was what Ellis had promised. Had they risked everything for a fantasy? Mallory stayed behind to secure their ship while the three men traveled inland. For hours they rode in silence, the future of their lives and their cause hanging by a thread. Then Valladolid rose before them. Confederate soldiers, the Belgian Legion, Florida sharecroppers, and Mayan workers labored shoulder to shoulder with their foreign allies. It was not wealth or grandeur that greeted them, but something rarer, a vision. And at the heart of it stood Ellis. For the first time since Richmond, hope began to feel real.
Ellis laid out the full measure of his vision. He spoke of the Yucatan's tangled caste system, of Creole elites, hardened mestizo militias, and Mayan communities scarred by generations of rebellion. Slavery, he declared, was banned and equal rights recognized by law. Yet Benjamin had understood a difficult truth. This settlement, fragile and surrounded by hostility, could not bear every burden of the Old South.
What you're proposing is a complete change of what the Confederacy was. The men who would otherwise support this new nation will do everything to subvert it. They will not support abolition. We all agree that slavery will not be tolerated. But I have to be honest with you, each of you. If we introduce free men into this colony, it will only bring grief and complications. These men, who have seen the horrors of war, will not accept it, right or wrong. We cannot risk violence or factions developing. All it takes is one incident. We must control the immigration here. And sadly, who cannot come?
Ellis did not argue Benjamin's point. His gaze was fixed on survival, on holding this fragile settlement together in a land that was not yet theirs. There, he stood before his soldiers to declare what they all already knew. The war was over.
As you may have heard, Lee surrendered. You men have fought bravely and with honor, and you deserve to go home. But I ask you this, what are you going home to? To live as a traitor under Yankee tyranny? You did everything that was asked of you. The men who sent you off to war won't so much as look at you as to thank you. The work you have done to turn this place into a real settlement has made it as much yours as it is mine. I cannot offer you much, but I can offer you this: hope and a home.
The three men set to work immediately. They acquired an historic colonial building from the Peon family in Merida, repurposing it as their official office. Reagan took charge of the settlement's lifeblood, its finances, budgets, communications, and law, drafting a legal code for this new, unrecognized nation. Benjamin departed for Mexico City, seeking an audience with Emperor Maximilian himself to secure 500,000 acres in Yucatan and Baja. Breckinridge oversaw the settlement's daily operations, coordinating defense and awaiting word from the Trans-Mississippi Department, with whom he had been secretly corresponding.
But as they worked, Ellis grew restless. His entire fortune, every coin, every asset, was now buried in this settlement. Its crops, its machines, its labor force, its ships. He even supplied the Mayans with food and tools, buying their loyalty, while many of his own fields would not produce profit for years. 100 men could not protect this fragile outpost from a determined strike. The railroad was his last bargaining chip, promised to elites whose support would turn violent if those promises were broken. Ellis's hopes rested entirely on his three partners, men he had prayed would not come alone.
Then, salvation arrived. General Edmund Kirby Smith and Colonel Santos Benavides led what remained of the Trans-Mississippi Department, 2,000 hardened men who had marched, starved, and bled their way south. With them, crates of supplies untouched by looters and every piece of artillery they could haul, proof that this remnant force still had teeth. Among them rode the fearless Joe Shelby, a cavalry commander who had burned his own colors rather than see them captured, leading his men with a reckless courage that bordered on myth. Beside him was Stand Watie, the legendary Cherokee general. Watie's band of seasoned native warriors swore an oath to never bow to the United States, carrying their defiance to this new land. Their presence added not just firepower, but a fierce spirit. And still, the men kept coming. They came ragged and hollow-eyed, carrying only the weight of their losses and the fire of their convictions. Some had nothing left but the will to fight. All were looking for hope. Among them was Thomas Jordan, the Confederacy's spy master, an officer as brilliant with codes and covert networks as any man in the war. He brought with him not just tactical knowledge, but an entire invisible world of informants, ciphers, and tradecraft that could give this struggling republic a fighting chance. Then came Jubal Early, the mean old man himself. Volatile, profane, and unyielding, Early was a man out of step with diplomacy, a general who had marched on Washington itself. His career had been undercut by Jefferson Davis's disdain, but his battlefield aggression was unquestionable. And finally, there was John Mosby, the Grey Ghost. A legend in his own time, Mosby's lightning-fast partisan rangers had terrorized Union supply lines for years, earning him a personal death sentence from Ulysses S. Grant. His rangers were no ordinary cavalry. They were an elite, unconventional guerrilla force, striking deep behind enemy lines, vanishing into the night, and redefining modern irregular warfare. That he stood here alive, free, and unbroken was a testament to his cunning and his will. But perhaps Breckinridge's most invaluable recruits came not with sabers or rifles, but with minds sharpened by steel and stone. Two of the most skilled railroad engineers of the war, Isaac Ridgway Trimble, a battle-hardened general, and William Robertson Boggs, a meticulous planner and strategist, arrived with a crew of men trained under the late John Morris Wampler, one of the Confederacy's greatest engineering minds. Where others saw sweltering jungle and endless miles of hostile terrain, they saw opportunity. With charts, compasses, and Wampler's legacy of precision, they began plotting a lifeline, a railroad stretching from Merida to Salina Cruz, cutting across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. It would be more than a rail line. It would be the spine of the new republic, binding its scattered holdings, feeding its commerce, and making good on Ellis's desperate promises to allies and elites. If Ellis had staked his fortune on the dream of Yucatan, it was Judah Benjamin who proved its worth. The former Confederate statesman arrived in Mexico City with a single goal: to secure 500,000 acres to ensure the settlement's survival. He returned with over 5 million acres in both Yucatan and the distant, barren peninsula of Baja, California. Benjamin's negotiation was nothing short of audacious. For the price of pledging the settlement's allegiance to France and Napoleon III, he secured vast stretches of land Maximilian himself struggled to govern. The Yucatan was isolated, choking on rebellion, while the distant Baja Peninsula was dismissed as worthless desert, unfit for profit or settlement. In a single stroke, he achieved what no Southern diplomat had ever dreamed of: the greatest land acquisition in modern history, won not with rifles but with ink and nerve.
But Benjamin did not return alone. With him rode Commodore Matthew Fontaine Maury, the brilliant navigator and scientist whose name was known in every maritime nation. A former officer of the US and Confederate navies, Maury was celebrated not only as a sailor, but as the founder of modern oceanography. His meticulous study of the seas had produced the first comprehensive wind and current charts, transforming global trade and naval strategy. Through his tireless work, he laid the scientific foundations for meteorology and modern geography, mapping the rhythms of the oceans and atmosphere like no man before him. Emperor Maximilian himself admired Maury's genius and encouraged him to lend his brilliance to Ellis's settlement. Maury arrived with a cadre of exceptional men: explorer and archaeologist William Marshall Anderson, his son, Colonel Richard Launcelot Maury, the charismatic General John B. Magruder, Sterling Price, Missouri's legendary commander, and diplomat Alexander W. Terrell. Maury was a visionary. He had long dreamed of establishing his own settlement, a colony dedicated to science and exploration, one that would chart unknown coasts, preserve natural habitats, and uncover the mysteries of ancient civilizations. From the moment Ellis and Maury met, they recognized in each other kindred spirits. This was no longer just a refuge for defeated men, but the beginning of a bold, new society.
By the dawn of 1866, the settlement had already begun to reshape the Yucatan. The construction of a railroad line transformed the peninsula almost overnight. Transport times for goods were slashed, and tons of henequen now flowed rapidly to the ports, turning fields of green into rivers of profit. It was during this surge of progress that there arrived one of the most remarkable men of the age, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, a commander whose genius on the battlefield had been squandered by Jefferson Davis's interference. Beauregard was a man courted by kings and emperors alike. He had been sought after to lead the armies of Brazil, Romania, and Egypt, and yet he had turned them all down. Ellis quickly saw why. Beauregard was more than a soldier. Trained as a military engineer, his mind was drawn not only to fortifications but to architecture, urban planning, and infrastructure. Ellis recognized that ambition and offered him what no emperor could. Beauregard was free to design not merely defenses, but a nation from the ground up.
It was through Beauregard's influence that the settlement gained another crucial mind, Ambrosio José González. A Cuban revolutionary turned Confederate officer, González was as skilled with politics as he was with strategy. Ellis immediately recognized his value and dispatched him as a diplomat to Central America, where González leveraged his background and reputation to open doors in Guatemala and Honduras. His mission was clear: build trust, forge agreements, and ensure the settlement's presence was felt far beyond Yucatan's borders. Hot on his heels came José Agustín Quintero, the poet-diplomat, a man of words who could sway kings and merchants alike. Assigned to France but carrying his mission farther still, Quintero sailed south, striking trade deals across South America. But these were not merely commercial ventures. They were foundations for alliances, quiet assurances that should the world once again be plunged into war, the Confederates of Yucatan would not stand alone. In these early years, the fledgling republic began to weave its first web of influence. Through González and Quintero, Ellis's reach across two continents, trading henequen and timber for goodwill and security. Under the cover of night, the CSS Shenandoah, captained by the legendary Navy commander James Iredell Waddell, arrived in Yucatan, bringing one of the Confederacy's most feared raiders into their ranks. At the same time, James Dunwoody Bullock quietly assembled a fleet of blockade runners and gunships from European yards, protecting trade routes and projecting power. Within months, the settlers commanded the strongest private navy in the world, turning their once isolated ports into hubs of global commerce and influence.
Baja California. A barren land of mountains and desert. Its value lay not in what it was, but what it could become. A stronghold on the Pacific, a gateway for trade, and a shield against future enemies. For such a place, Ellis needed more than a commander. He needed a leader who could carve order from wilderness and hold it with steel. And so, he turned to a man who had lived on frontiers his entire life.
I have safe houses marked along that route. If something happens, I'm not going to be able to reach you. I'm sure your spies would get you word long before I could.
These towns are strategic. I'm impressed.
I learned it from you.
Ellis placed Santos in command of Baja, granting him control over its growing mining operations and trade routes. But as the settlement took shape, its greatest danger would not come from rebels or raiders, but from within. Among the men who had followed Ellis to Yucatan was Colonel Archibald S. Dobbins, a veteran of the Trans-Mississippi Department. Once a wealthy planter, now stripped of his slaves and lands, Dobbins saw Ellis's policies as betrayal. To him, Ellis was no liberator, but a tyrant, and in whispers and shadows he began gathering those who agreed. Dobbins and his disillusioned followers made their stand not with bullets, but with fire, torching barns and storehouses before fleeing south. They vanished into Brazil, a land where slavery still lingered, chasing the ghost of a world already gone. The fires were extinguished, the barns rebuilt, and the settlement endured. As word spread of a new beginning far from the chaos of Reconstruction, more than 10,000 souls journeyed south, seeking hope and a life unshackled from the ruin of war. But beyond the borders of the settlement, danger closed in. Benito Juárez's forces rose in rebellion, sweeping through Mexico and toppling Maximilian's empire. Captured and imprisoned, the emperor refused every attempt of escape that Ellis offered. Maximilian chose to face the firing squad with dignity, dying with the honor of a man unwilling to flee his fate. With Maximilian dead, Juárez seized full control of Mexico. His attention turned south toward the foreign settlers in Yucatan.
The tension broke in blood, an ambush on a Confederate patrol, but Mosby's Rangers struck back with ruthless precision, killing and capturing every attacker and delivering the survivors for Ellis to see firsthand the war that was coming.
Who are you?
My name is Major Marcus Riley of the United States Army.
Major, welcome to the Yucatan.
As Juarez tightens his grip on Mexico, the Yucatan settlement braces for war. What comes next will be a clash of empires, a violent reckoning that will decide whether Ellis's vision thrives or is wiped from history, and its outcome will change the world forever.